And joining us from Brussels in Belgium, we've got Charlie Stuart, who is the European Union Chief Security Advisor for Africa. And we're going to talk about what's going on down in Africa at the moment. How are you doing, Charlie?
Very well. Thank you, Nicole. And very grateful to have the opportunity to be on the show.
Yeah, well, always a pleasure to have guys like you on. I just did second last one was with a senior NATO general. And we talked about geopolitics, and we didn't talk about Africa, funnily enough. But now you're the man for the job. So I guess the first question is going to be: is how do you get a job in the European Union?
Well, it's my career is an interesting one because I started out as an army officer in the British Army, and after that I left at the age of 28, which is kind of a natural watershed for people to decide whether they're going to leave or stay. And then I went off to law school and became a lawyer, practiced as a corporate lawyer for about 9 years. And then after that, I went to the private sector, worked as a director of a private security company in the UK, which was kind of around the time that the second Gulf War happened. So it was like the gold rush. It was just an insane amount of work coming out of Iraq after the liberation. And I did that for a couple of years, and then was actually recruited into the European Union in 2008, and brought in ostensibly to set up their security service for all of their operations overseas. And then found myself fast-tracked into the diplomatic side of the house. So I went to Iraq again in 2013 for about 4 years as the deputy ambassador there, and interesting time because, of course, it coincided with the emergence, the rise, the zenith, and then the eventual decline of ISIS in Iraq. And that was a fascinating time. I was the only Western diplomat who was there for that entire duration. But of course, after 4 years of that, it's time to move on. So I moved with the family to Tanzania as initially as the deputy ambassador, and then I took over as our head of delegation there. And then, dare I say it, Brexit struck. And all the Brits that were working for the EU, particularly they were working overseas, were recalled. And I found myself back in Brussels because of the nature of my contract. I was able to stay, which was good. But most of the people left. There's only 12 of us left that don't have second passports, so we're calling ourselves the Dirty Dozen, and we'll go down to, there's more and more people either die or retire or move on. We'll go down to the Magnificent Seven, the famous Five. And the joke amongst us is that the last person is either going to be known as the last Mohican or the Messiah in the hope of the second coming. I think that's the ambition. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you? Oh, no, we can come back. We'll come back to that. I was going to ask you about whether you could foresee Britain rejoining the EU, but we'll come back to that because that's probably a bigger topic to talk about. But just before we go there, we were just talking a bit off air there that you served in the first Gulf War.
That's right.
Back in the early 90s. So what rank were you when you were there?
I was a lieutenant. I was one of those. I joined the army in 1986 and went off to Brigade Squad, which was something my regiment, the Scots Guards. And Brigade Squad was something that was an 8-week course that young potential officers all had to do. It was basically an opportunity for the household division to look at their potential officers and see whether they could cut it. And of course, then you go off to the regular commissions board, and then you're either successful or not in being awarded the basic standard. Back then, there were very few officers going off to university, and I was one of the lucky ones that was going to university, but was also given a scholarship to go to university, which then meant that I had my rank, and I was actually paid not my full salary, but part of salary whilst I was at university. So it meant that the beers were very much on Charlie for much of my 3 years there. And then when I came back out of university, I went to Sandhurst again to complete the full, what was then a 6-month course. And I joined the battalion in Germany. We were stationed in Kona, in North Germany, which is up.
I know it well.
Up to close to where I believe you were. And in fact, Tom Ketch, who was on your show recently, was also up the road as well. If I remember correctly.
Yes. So what were you doing in Germany? Were you armored infantry?
Yeah, I was armored infantry, so we started off literally as I joined. We were doing the conversion from the old AFV 432 up to the new, what was then the new Warrior. And almost overnight, of course, the backdrop to all of this, whilst this was going on, was that the Iraq had invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein had gone into Kuwait and had taken it over in the summer of 1990. And by the late autumn, units were starting to get informed of being prepared for mobilizing. And I became part of the training team that was preparing units to go off. But then the Scots Guards was identified as more and more as a second brigade went in. The realization was that it might be quite hairy. And so they started mobilizing battle casualty replacements. So I had a rather unglorious role of being a BCR. But initially, they only sent one platoon. So I was nominated to lead the platoon from the Scots Guards, which is great because, of course, then what I had is I was able to recruit from the battalion the best the battalion can offer. So you can imagine it was a really privileged thing. I got promoted as a result of it to that. And then about a week before we were due to deploy, everything was going. I can't tell you, it's one of the happiest, most satisfying moments of my career of building a team of absolute pure excellence and working towards something that everyone was really excited about going. We then inherited, and I won't say which regiment, but we inherited 8 folks who had decided, should we say, not to deploy. And had been recovered by the military police and were brought back. And they were then embedded in my platoon, and I lost 8 of what I consider the foreign guard of the battalion. And I had these 8 fellows who clearly didn't want to be there and didn't want to go. So it was an interesting exercise in the dynamic and the chemistry amongst people who were not guardsmen, who then had to adapt themselves within about 2 weeks, as I say, before we actually deployed. So it was quite an exercise in getting the team realigned and reconfigured.
So had they gone diffie?
Yes.
So that means in the British Army, that means you've gone absent without leave, AWOL. A big no-no, especially during a conflict. So the ones that didn't want to go. Okay. How did that go? How were they in the end?
Fantastic. And they were absolutely brilliant. And again, that was another thing I'm very proud of, in fact, is that we actually did manage to assimilate them fully, and they became very much part of the team. And by the time the war was over and we all came home, they walked back with their heads up and their shoulders back. So I was immensely proud of them, what they did, because they did deliver on the day. It was very.
And did you guys get into any action when you were there?
No, we didn't. I mean, again, if you recall, I mean, there weren't actually that many casualties. So I think it was the Royal Fusiliers that had lost about 7 during a blue-on-blue incident, and by that stage, the rest of the battalion had shown up, and the way they decided to configure it was, so I just basically rejoined my company that I was part of. And the way they configured it was that one company would be set aside for individual replacements, one company would be for platoon size replacements, and then the third company would be for if there was a requirement for a full company. And so my company was identified as being for platoon replacements in the middle. So in fact, what happened to the Fusiliers, I think, was on about the 2nd or 3rd day of the war. It meant that only a small number were taken out from the other company. So after all of that preparation, actually my war was not a particularly glorious one. It was just trundling through the desert, and then of course it was over and we all came home. So I remember it was an interesting exercise because my brother had fought in the Falklands in 1982 and had been recognised for his action there. He was only 19 as a platoon commander, and his platoon sergeant was killed in the first first rounds that came down off the mountain on Mount Tumbledown. It was the last battle of the So he'd only been out of Santos a couple of weeks, so he found himself in this rather extraordinary situation, which he was able to do very well. He was very well supported by his subsequent. But I remember thinking when I went off to the Gulf, this is my time, this is my war, and this is what I'm going to do. And I remember when it was all over, actually getting really frustrated, and I'm not proud to say it, but frustrated that I knew that actually I hadn't done it on yes, but I had been part of it. I hadn't done anything to sort of what I would say test myself after all of that preparation. And I just remember my platoon sergeant at the time. It was a signal moment actually, because he just looked at me and said, "Sir, it doesn't matter. We're all going home." And that to me was a I wouldn't say a slap in the face, but it was just this is what this is. And you get the job done, go on. And the fact is we're all going.
And that's the main aim, right?
Yeah.
Come home in one piece.
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. And your brother was in the Falklands. That must have been, that's probably another podcast, but that must have been that for those who might not be aware of the Falkland, that's in the Falkland Islands, just off the coast of Argentina, middle of the Atlantic, very, very far south. Horrible time of year to be there. And it was a pretty nasty fight. And
it was an interesting one because, of course, it was a time, 1982. It was probably since I've got Korea and obviously Northern Ireland was taking place as a backdrop since the late 60s. But the Falklands was really the first time that the British Army had been engaged in anything for a number of years. And if you look at the quality of the that they took back then, I mean, people were still wearing puttees, which was something that you wrap around your car to keep your legs that date back to the First World War, to the Boer War before, back in the 19th century. And it's extraordinary. It's one of the things that's quite interesting because the Scots Guards, they were the only battalion that went up against a regular Argentine unit as opposed to a conscript unit. All the other engagements were conscripts. But the Scots Guards chose not to have journalists embedded with them. So there's very little coverage of that final battle. And everybody did extraordinary things, remarkable things. But all the glory goes to the Paras and the Marines. The Welsh Guards, of course, had that tragedy on Galahad and Sir Tristram, two support vessels that were by the Argentine Air Force as they were waiting to come ashore, which effectively decimated the battalion and its ability to do anything. And then the war was over.
I remember that when I was a kid. When you look back, I actually know a few people who were there as well, as parachute regiment guys. But it was a tough one. And as you say, it hadn't been a long time since you're actually fighting another country. Yeah, probably since Korea. I mean, Korea, Aden, maybe, I don't know, but around a fair few decades anyway. Yeah, geez. Brings it home a little bit now.
Well, it does. When you compare today to the kind of level of tactical expertise and operational expertise amongst the young officers, young soldiers, young commissioned officers who have chests of medals like Montgomery. It's extraordinary. You look at the kind of DNA that's on display on their chest, and it's a different military set it was when I was in. I was very much a Cold War warrior. We sat on the German border expecting whatever it was, the Soviet Third Shock Army to come racing over the border, and nothing ever happened. And probably thank God it did.
Well, there's still time for that.
Yeah, well, yes, Cold War.
Yeah. Don't count your chickens.
Exactly.
I happened to join just as it was all going off in 97. So it was a very interesting time for me. But I talk to the guys now. They haven't done anything for a long time. Well, it's a good thing. Don't get me wrong. It's a good thing. But they feel that they missed out. But you know what? I'm not sure. I just want to ask this question now, but since we're talking about the militarist aspect of things, and I know you're not military anymore and haven't been for a long, long time, but you're still a security advisor. But what's your view, if you can talk about it, or tell us what you can, about the formation of an EU army?
Well, I knew, during the days when the UK was part of it, there was a lot of resistance on the part of the UK towards the establishment of that. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to a number of elements, one of which is command and control, and an agreement over what that command and control is and who's in charge. The uniformity of equipment and uniform supply chain, all of the kind of things that make an army work, which despite NATO standards, there are still differences within national structures. And I think, again, it's always that sort of thing of what is, and another question would be about scale, is what really we're talking about. It's just a brigade to do what, and when. So I think there are lots of discussions around it. There's some logic in having it because you do standardize, you do. There was always a discussion. I remember back in the 90s, rather than each nation producing its own ships, tanks, helmets, whatever it may be, if you were going to have, let's say, the Germans produce the best tanks, they produce all the tanks for the European armies, the French produce the best aircraft, whatever. So there's a logic in rationalizing, but it becomes a bit of the risk is it becomes a bit of a hodgepodge. And then command and control, training, cost of maintaining it, and at the end of the day, what's it going to do? Where's it going to be?
Because I guess the obvious question is, if countries, certainly for the past, at least the past 30 years, don't like to spend money on their military, at least 30 years, because it's an expensive business. And I don't think it's particularly, I could be wrong, but it's not necessarily a vote winner, depends on which party gets in, But I guess there would also been a lot of resistance based on the fact that they're already paying 2% of their GDP towards NATO. And then they would have to then basically duplicate the same thing. You've got a NATO force and you've got your EU force. And that would be a bit tricky, wouldn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And of course, then you've got to ask yourself the question whether 2% is really enough. And they talk about raising it. I think it's 4% or something by 2030. Well, 2030 might be too late if things go south. Which, God willing, it doesn't. But the question is, it's all about preparedness. Ultimately, it's how prepared are we? How resilient are we as a society to be confronted? It's very interesting talking to my kids about growing up in the Cold War. You're part of that as well. The idea of in classrooms in schools, hiding under your desk in preparation for a nuclear strike or something. 1984 came and went. Nothing. There wasn't the Big Bang. The millennium came and planes fall out of the sky. But we lived in a time where there was a very real threat that could have impacted our lives, and to a certain degree, we were ready for it in terms of civil preparedness for something. And I just wonder today whether that's the case, whether the resilience is there amongst society and communities to be able to withstand.
Yeah, because I don't, obviously I live in Switzerland. I picked a nice neutral spot after my service, and there's a lot of expat people living here, a lot of Brits, Swedes, a lot of EU people, Americans, and I've a lot of friends who are younger in their 20s, early 30s, that sort of prime age group, I guess, about would you go and fight if there was a conflict in Russia? Would you go back home and sign up? And to a man, they all said no. And so and I just wonder, I was going to bring this up with General Borton about what is the plan, because it seems to me that there's just not the appetite, there's not the appetite for it. And I think when you take into account that the media is not the traditional media, shall we call it, the mainstream media, is not. It's not in charge of the narrative nowadays, and there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of different sources of information coming through, but you can't, distill the information and point it in a certain direction. Or that you can try, but I think that's gone out the window, and there just doesn't seem to be the appetite. So I don't know. I don't know how that can be overcome. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the whole question about deterrence as well. Is whether whether you have the political will as well as the means to execute the political will if it's demonstrated. And right now, and that is the basis of deterrence. If you have those elements in place, then very posture. The question now is whether we really do. So this is no secret. This has been often talked about in the open in the media and on online discussions and stuff. So the real question is first and foremost is what is the threat, and being ready both understand that threat and understand what is needed to respond to it. Back in the Cold War, yes, there were lots of nasty little wars and conflicts taking place around the world, but by and large, in a bipolar world, there was relative safety because there was that strong deterrence posture. Now, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, 1990, America satisfied the world like global sort of monopolar power, the world's police. But in '94 they engaged in Somalia. 93, 94 they engaged in Somalia and actually left with their tails between their legs. If you remember the speed with which President Clinton pulled out the American forces after Black Hawk Down to helicopters, there's images of soldiers being dragged through the streets, which was shocking. But that also coincided with 24-hour news coverage. So again, I don't know if you remember the images of CNN on the beach in Mogadishu as the Navy SEALs came ashore. So it's very much about feeding the tyranny of real time, the real time coverage, and the need to have those images out as far as the networks, the broadcast teams are concerned. But the result of America coming out in the 90s of Somalia, it emboldened, you could argue, a whole chain of events through the 90s. You look at Rwanda, you look at Haiti, you look at Balkans, which you yourself were involved in, and Cambodia and elsewhere. So what you had was you had all of these little flare-ups taking place because people knew that actually the world's policing wasn't going to get involved because the world's policing had left at the first test. And there's a very good book written by General Rupert Smith called The Utility of War, which I recommend to any of your listeners to read. It's very much this sort of reflection on we don't need to engage in everything, but it is a case of identifying where it is necessary, what are the strategic interests, what are the goals, and what's the end state. I'm hosting him in Brussels next year for such an event. He lives in Brussels. We're going to talk about the how things have moved on since he wrote and whether he would revisit the book in view of what's happened in the last 10, 15 years around the world.
But do you think, you made an interesting point there about Rwanda, because that was something, again, which was broadcast, not live, thankfully, but there's a lot of news journalists there at the time to see what was going on, which for us in the West you hear about a massacre, and you hear about a massacre in some other country, then you don't actually, it's something that you hear, you go, oh, that's horrible. And I wouldn't say forget about it, but it goes away. You don't really think about it much. But then you see what was happening there, and it was being broadcast every day, every night on the news. We're watching this, and I was quite, and I wouldn't say morbid fascination, but you know what I mean. You're trying to see what was going on. I didn't realize that came about because of Bill Clinton's,
I
Their
did.
failure in Somalia.
There were plenty of reasons why it came about, but the question is whether as a result of seeing the kind of the notion that back in the day during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the Americans played the world's police. They were very much against each other. They engaged each other through proxies. Now you take one of those components out, and actually, if the world's policeman is not going to get engaged, there has to be an element of then emboldening people to say, well, okay, I can do this. And then what are they going to do? I can do it with complete impunity. And you look at the Balkans in the 90s, what happened there and how that played out. It wasn't really until NATO then kind of really went from hot that things started, at least created the environment, pretext for dating.
Yeah, because it's when you, to give some context for maybe people who weren't quite as close to it as we were, or watching it as we were, the massacres in Rwanda was, I'm going to do it really, really basic soundbite type, but it was one tribe against the other. And it wasn't, they didn't have, it wasn't, weapons of mass destruction or even small arms. It wasn't, rifles, and it was heavy sticks and machetes, which is is horrifying. And you used to see these pictures, and it really was absolutely horrifying. And then you had UN troops went in, and I think if I remember right, they had a plane shot down. The commander was murdered, or one of the commanders on the ground was murdered, and they said, well, we don't have the assets to do anything about this. And so I think they pulled out pretty quickly as well. And it went on for an intolerable amount of time. That was just a very weird situation.
Yeah, the two very good films, Hotel Rwanda and
I haven't seen it.
The second one's called Shooting Dogs, which is this extraordinary thing where the UN found itself in a situation where their rules of engagement as neutrals did not allow them to step in and interfere, but they were able to shoot dogs that were awfully feasting off the bodies.
Same thing in Bosnia though. When it was under the UN control, when there were troops there, they had sticks. I remember seeing the photographs, and I was there not long after that happened. We weren't. We were fully armed, but they were. It was they were basically watching helplessly as there was concentration camps in a place where we go on holiday now in Croatia. There was in Yugoslavia. It was so bizarre, and it's not fun. I could drive there in 10 hours. It's a part of Europe. And you go there now, it's a very beautiful place. But it kind of takes me back where I was going to ask you, because Rwanda now seems, they sponsor Arsenal Football Club and Visit Rwanda, and they seem to have turned it around. Have you been down there?
I have indeed. Yeah, when I was living in Tanzania, we travelled up there quite a bit, just to, either for business or for pleasure. But, it's a beautiful country. It's a really remarkable country, as indeed all of the countries are in that region. My family originally came from Uganda, and my grandfather had been the Bishop of Uganda for nearly 30 years. And then my father had played rugby in Uganda back in the days where, I don't know whether your listeners will remember this character, but a certain Lance Corporal Idi Amin played in the second row, and Dad played number 8. Dad's great story was, he said, probably one of the few people that's had their heads close to a future dictator's buttocks, and lived to tell the tale.
Yeah, Idi Amin was a notorious dictator who also went a bit crazy, started massacring his own people. Really good film. It's a very good film. It's a quite harrowing film. Yeah. Last King of Scotland. It's actually a really good film. The Hotel Rwanda film, I'm not going to watch that because I remember watching it on the news and being horrified back, when it originally happened. But maybe I'll go back and watch it. But so what has changed in Rwanda that has now become a tourist destination? Is it? I mean, obviously, first thing is going to be the stability of government. But was there not some problem with the boss of Rwanda at one stage that he was being accused of all sorts of different things? And yeah, you tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a nutshell, I mean, the success of Rwanda is based on the kind of truth and reconciliation that came following the genocide, and the efforts to try and smoothen out or reconcile the differences between the various the tribal elements, which some would say require a heavy hand to do that. But in so doing, recognizing the the the, the opportunity for inward investment help the country reconstruct itself. I mean, it's remarkable when you go. They have a thing where every week, I think it is, every Sunday, every citizen has to go out and clean the streets. And it's a point of bringing people together. Now, that's not to say that there isn't to have undergone that trauma as a society. That takes generations to ease out. But it's a remarkable process of seeing an opportunity to make a country prosperous that has potential. Now, it's a small country, it's a manageable country, so it's not compared to its neighbour in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is enormous. And in terms of being able to govern that real estate with all of the kind of components in there that lead to uncertainty and instability. And these are the discussions really that we're having. Talk a little bit about it, but these are the discussions that I'm having at the moment is with African leaders is as we reflect on post-COVID, the lessons learned or identified from COVID, and the need as Europeans from a European perspective, to see Africa as a marketplace and to diversify supply chain away from decouple, not entirely but partially from dependence on China, is Africa offers an enormous opportunity, and as Europeans, we worry about questions of migration, we worry about questions of security, all this sort of stuff. But in many ways, the answer lies in working together as partners with African nations towards prosperity. Well, that's easy to say that, but actually, what does that mean? And those are the discussions that need to be had of how do we get there? Let's work together to get there. Let's recognize that if you want trade and investment as opposed to development, which has always very much been the default model, trade and investment, the market won't withstand the instability. So it's about, okay, to get towards your goal, we've got to have on this journey, we've got to work out how to reduce that instability. So what does that mean? And what does that look? How are we going to do diplomatically? How are we going to do economically, socially, militarily, maybe? As I say, it sounds a bit sort of idealistic, but at the end of the day, we are faced with a growing competition in Africa from partners, from competitive partners, and from competitors that requires us to think about how we engage with African partners who want to have a relationship, but they don't want to be sort of entirely beholden to one partner. They want to be able to diversify their partnerships and not feel like they can't. So there's an element there of recognition of the dynamic that we now are faced with in the world and the need to adapt and adjust accordingly. The challenge for us, of course, is that in the Western world, we are very much values-based, human rights and stuff. These are universal values. These aren't European values. But we're competing against people who are becoming increasingly more transactional. And by being transactional, of course, that means that you can kind of turn the stance to values. This is the dynamic of the world that we're confronted with at the moment. So the issue for us is we can't compromise on our values because that's who we are. That's a cornerstone of who we are as Western world. But at the same time, we need to also be more transactional. So how do you ride those two horses in a way that actually respects one but promotes the other?
How do you do that?
Well, I think often it's a way of it's language, and it's when you're communicating with partners, it's not what you say, it's how you say. So I had an incident in Tanzania. If we have time to talk about it, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, please do. Plenty.
In Tanzania, where the Tanzanians had introduced a law that made it illegal for young schoolgirls to get pregnant. Now, this was I would say, is a fairly draconian approach to child control, to birth control. The idea was if you threaten a young woman with expulsion from school if she gets pregnant, then she won't get pregnant. But of course, that presupposes that was her choice, as opposed to the fact that 99% figures out a substantial proportion of the time it wasn't her choice. And the fact was that she became the victim in more ways than one. And so you can imagine from a European perspective and from an American perspective, there was a huge outcry against this, and people got very upset, and meant every time diplomats we had to go in to speak to the Tanzanians. The first item on the agenda was always about teenage pregnancies. It became a sort of exercise, and you cannot do this, it's wrong. But what happened over time, inevitably, was that the Tanzanians said, well, do you know, we're fed up, because every time you come in, you just wave your finger at us, and actually, you know, I'd rather not have that. So I'd rather get to talk to someone else. So it meant that over time, the shutters were closing, the doors were closing, and the windows were coming down. And there were other things we needed to talk about, not least from a security point of view. There were things happening in northern Mozambique, which was gathering momentum. Because of events in Iraq and Syria, the global heroin trade was being pushed into Africa as opposed to taking the northern route into Europe via Iraq and Syria, which was becoming too dangerous. So we were seeing a huge spike in heroin trade that was coming on shore in parts of Eastern Africa and then moving its way up to Europe. But we needed to be able to talk to our partners about how do we respond to this threat, this emerging revolt. And what happened is that my predecessor actually was recalled by Brussels because of events that took place. And I then had to take over. And my instruction from Brussels was you've got to get back in the room with the Tanzanians and you've got to overturn the law. And so it became a sort of exercise of, okay, right, how am I going to do that? Because I know that if I go in and start talking about teenage pregnancies, they're just, I'll be on the next plane. So I had to think a little bit carefully about how to change the narrative, how to come at it from a slightly different angle. So rather than talk about human rights, what I talked about was very much the economic consequences of denying a young woman's right to fulfill her potential. And that actually the country at the time was on a very aggressive industrialization program. And if you then say, okay, you're taking half of your workforce, she becomes a social cost as opposed to a net contributor to the ambition that's been set. And of course, you're taking a potential taxpayer out of the market. So I knew I couldn't really talk about this because it was all very, I wasn't in the room. So I had to kind of think of other ways to get around this. And I started looking at other obstacles to women's development, which was gender-based violence, child marriage, and female genital mutilation, FGM, which is something that's prevalent in the country. But this was illegal, so I knew that I was on safe ground by having this conversation. Now, we had no money for this, we had no projects, investment in countering FGM, but there were lots of other actors doing that, lots of NGOs, and the United Nations and others. And they were all doing good stuff, but there wasn't a lot of what I'd call coherence amongst all the various efforts. And what I was trying to do was really try to understand why FGM was happening. And I was talking more and more to the Maasai tribal elders. And I was eventually invited to go and talk to the tribal council. It was me on my own with 140 tribal elders. In order to be able to speak to the council, I had to be made a tribal elder myself to hold the appropriate office to address the council.
Do you have to dress up?
No, but I had a stick which I was able to given as my seat of badge of office to be able to address the council. I said to them, look, just help me understand, because what I was realizing, the reason it was happening in Tanzania was because a lot of people made money from it. So if you stop it, actually people stand to lose livelihood. And so it became an exercise in saying, okay, how can we find a way where you can still make money out of this process, but you just don't do the cutting? And so I said, look, if you could still have the party, you can still make the dresses, you can still prepare all the foods like a wedding, ballets, baptisms, but just don't do the cutting. Is that acceptable? And they agreed. And they agreed to a moratorium for about 2 years. They said, okay, we're not going to do this and see how it goes, which meant that we calculated it was about 4,500 young girls were not touched during that period. Now, what was interesting, of course, is then Uganda and Kenya started to engage with us about cross-border cooperation and improving we managed to get Tanzania showcased in the General Assembly in the UN in September of that year, talking about what they were doing to counter FGM. We were able to get 2 young Maasai girls to travel around Europe to talk about their experiences of escaping from FGM. And I think FGM is now on the national curriculum of about 17 countries in Europe about it. And then what happened was that slowly but surely, the Tanzanians started to see what we were trying to do. And I got called in by the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education to talk about what was happening. And they built a national slogan about preventing obstacles to preventing a young woman's progress, which included child-based marriage, gender-based violence, FGM, and teenage pregnancy. So it became a national slogan. There was a national dialogue set up to look at ways to promote young women to improve the prospects for success. And I was then called in by the president who asked me what's going on, and I told him and explained my rationale in economic terms. And I'm very proud to say that within a number of months, actually the law was overturned. So I'm getting to the point where it's not what you say, it's how you say, which is I think the basis of any partnership is respect for each other, respect for other people's perspectives, come onto your side of the table and see the problem through their eyes, and then engage respect. And it was as simple as that. But fast forward to today, now apart from the 4,000 that were not 4,500 that were not cut back then, the prevalence is way down in all 3 countries. So it's a fact that there is momentum there that actually is bearing fruit. And the cost of that, to finish it off, the cost of that, to me, apart from my time, was the price of 2 mobile telephones that I gave to those 2 young girls that went to Europe to write a blog about their experience. So it's not always about spending money. It's a methodology that can you can replicate elsewhere to all sorts of problems in front of it. It's very, very strict.
Yeah. Oh, what a horrible subject to touch on as well. Just the thought about that. But let's talk about the Chinese Belt and Road policy. The Belt and Road policy being their idea to connect the world through, I think it's pretty much the old Silk Road, isn't it? Trying to connect all these countries with infrastructure. And they've been making great roads into Africa because they're offering African nations investment. And which obviously European countries used to do, American countries would have done too, when it comes to mineral and resource extraction. Are there any other countries trying to, don't want to say muscle in, but get in on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are. I mean, it's very publicized, but the role of the Russian influence in Africa is noteworthy. I don't think the Russians are financially in the same wheelhouse as the Chinese in terms of being able to support infrastructure development. They just financially, economically, they can't. They're not in a position to do that. But we've all heard about the organisation Wagner and Prigozhin, which was who led the coup against Putin last year, and then subsequently was killed in a plane or helicopter or something. What you're seeing is, and again, you'll be familiar with this. What you're seeing is increasing Russian presence across parts of Africa, where an opportunity presents itself to destabilize pre-existing partnerships, and that's through foreign interference, fake news, all the kind of it's all the stuff that undermines, which risks accelerating the narrative around colonialism and how bad colonialism was. But in many ways, it's being done on the cheap, and there are examples of coming out of some countries in West Africa where actually the Wagner operators are not being paid. All the money that's being generated is going straight back to Moscow. But what's happening is that those Wagner operators are being told, okay, you basically fund yourselves, and you can do whatever you want, and no one will pay much attention to. So there are a number of human rights agencies that are recording horrific human rights abuses being carried out by these operators on the ground, simply because they haven't paid. So again, it's this thing of be careful. The message we are passing is very much be careful about who you talk to. Be careful about the pact you enter into and invite people in, because actually, if you want to have prosperity and if you want to have stability, this is a questionable way of going about it.
But so the end game, I've actually been reading. Do you remember those Wilbur Smith books?
Yeah.
From back in the day. I started reading those recently. They were very fascinating. Learned an awful lot about African history. Well, certainly Southern African. I think it's moving a bit further north now. As the further into the books I got. They're fantastic books, by the way. My mom was reading them when I was a kid, and I never really thought anything about them. And then a friend of mine recommended one the other day, so now I'm hooked. So it's always been like, there's always been. It's not a proxy war, but it's a proxy conflict. Certainly in post World War II, you've got the countries that went communist were backed by the communist countries, those backed by the West, and nothing's really changed, I suppose. I guess that you still have. There's a lot to play for in Africa. Seems to be an awful lot of wealth, mineral wealth, precious metals, farmland. You ever seen that map when they superimpose all these different countries on the continent of Africa? When you because of our map, the world map, the world we see, Africa is by far and away the biggest. It's absolutely enormous, and you can fit US, China, everyone fits in there. It's that big, and obviously in the future we're going to have this. As the population expands, we're going to have to feed everyone, and so I guess the gold rush is on to get this land now, which brings another question for me. That's kind of almost stating the obvious. Is we have a lot of illegal immigration coming from Africa, both to the United States, to the south, to the South America as well, and also into Europe. And I understand that there's economic considerations there, that they're looking for a better life, and I 100% I understand that. But had we not, us in the West, paid more attention to this in the past, and maybe not been so disregarding the locals when extracting the wealth, that the situation we wouldn't be in the current situation that we are.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a complex subject in the sense that it's often about understanding both the pull and the push factors, and it may be the perception of streets of paper gold in Europe, or it may be that the domestic situation or regional situation is drives people out. They say, "Do you know what? I can't move." In fact, I think in 2015, during the height of the crisis, the refugee crisis there. And I think the one word that people cited as their reasons why they left their country of origin was hopelessness. And it takes quite a lot to leave your motherland and go through an extraordinary journey to get to where you want to go to. No guarantee you'll get there, you'll necessarily live up to the expectation. To your point earlier, I think what you're seeing now is that there used to be there's a very famous book, I forget the author, called Scramble for Africa, which talked about exactly what you said, is this scramble for resource that took place in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And I think it would be fair to say that we're witnessing a second scramble, which is as people start to see the value of the resources that have not yet been exploited, or could still be exploited, creates yet another dynamic. So you're seeing this sort of what I call, and this is generally across the board, is a sort of general slide from politics, shifting then into the economics, shifting into the social space, and then shifting into the security space. And the trend is a sort of downward trend, which is risks accelerating because you get megatrends like population growth, you get megatrends like climate change, all of which accelerates the sort of downward trend, which means that as you invest more in the security sector to counter rising concerns about jihadism or whatever it may be, that's taking money away from money that could be spent in the health and educational sectors, or which therefore means that as people leave school, assuming they're able to complete their studies, the risk is that they drift towards violence and extremism simply because there are no opportunities. And I think the question here is the need for a long-term strategy to understand the current dynamic, that events are changing around the world, are accelerating this downward trend: food insecurity, water insecurity, the kind of shockwaves coming out of Ukraine, shockwaves coming out of events in the Red Sea that are forcing Europe's trade. That's about 23% of Europe's trade comes via the Red Sea up through the Suez Canal, because of events that are taking place down there, with Houthis targeting the shipping lanes, the vital artery that runs through the Red Sea. That is then forcing ships southwards around the Big Horn. Sorry. Okay, good night. Sorry.
Yeah,
Right,
the other
and then
one.
up the other side, which of course then means that raises shipping costs, fuel, insurance, security. And all of those costs then need to be reflected in marketplaces that are already vulnerable. And again, the cost of the rising inflation, all the kind of things that we know, but it's just trying to understand you can't do everything. But actually what you can do is you can try and sort of work out where you can best apply effort to improve not only short-term solution, but long-term investment to improve prospects for stability, which then you could argue might disincentivize people to leave their countries of origin in the first place.
It's all very complicated, Charlie. I don't know, geopolitics. You can, when you try and get your head around it, there's just so much in play. Ultimately, each country is trying to make as much money as they can out of whatever situation they can find. And yeah, I don't really see. I can see a way forward, but it's gonna require a global cooperation. Has there been any attempts at a global cooperation, like a global strategy between the West and Russia and China?
Well, no. I think the thing is we are faced with this current situation where, as I say, we're dealing with competitors who are looking to change the existing world order as it is, and replace it with something else, which is not entirely clear necessarily. All the price tag is associated. So for us, it's about understanding the new dynamic, which is is how do we adapt the way that we function, the way that we operate, without compromising on who we are, but finding ways to promote our interests, to become more transactional, as I say, without compromising on who we are as values as human beings. Whilst at the same time not becoming so distracted that your all of your eggs go. There's always a sort of knee-jerk pendulum approach where you focus everything on climate change one moment, and then suddenly it's something else, and you pivot away from that towards something else. Whereas actually, the way I was described to people, it's a bit like if you imagine logs flowing down a river and building up a dam, and the dam stops the water from flowing. Our human instinct is to jump in and pull out our individual log for which we are responsible. Now, often with little effect at all, no outcome. Whereas actually, you just bothered to step back for one moment and said, okay, what I'm trying to do here is to get the water to start flowing again. What I should do is if I just focus all of my effort on one thing over here, pull that log out, the laws of physics apply, it releases 10 over here with no effort at all. But the risk is that if you just engage in, I'll step back, should hopefully make it easy to understand. There's a famous Chinese saying, Sun Tzu, who came up with this saying that strategy without tactics is the slow path to success. But tactics without strategy is the last sound you hear. And the risk is that if you don't have a sense of the strategic goal you're trying to achieve, you just end up doing stuff for the sake of doing stuff. And you measure success not by what the outcome is or the effect of all of that investment, but you measure success by how many people you train, how much equipment you deliver, or how much money you spend. Well, so what? What's the impact? And very much, that's something that we need to be better at doing is regarding the outcome and understanding what outcome we're trying to achieve and the pathway that's needed that's we're going to go on to get. And how do we use the resources that we have? There's no point coming up with a master plan on paper because the reality is the context or the situation on the ground won't allow it because you don't have the tools available to build the plane.
Mm. You mentioned before as well transnational crime and especially the drugs trade. I can imagine the continent of Africa being quite a febrile area for the drugs trade because they tend to use fairly unscrupulous means, but money, of course, being the main driver, governments can be corrupted very easily. It doesn't have to necessarily be drugs, but if you're looking for easier routes into Europe and the Western markets, how is it? What have you seen with regards to organized crime, external organized crime at work in Africa?
Well, I think the evolving threat, which is worrisome, is the growing evidence of the nexus between organized crime and terror. So there's a sort of symbiosis that is emerging, whereby they're able to leverage off one another. That's not to say they're necessarily in bed with each other, but there's a sort of a relationship of convenience that exists that previously wasn't necessary. So to give an example, you have illicit trade coming into certain countries where, as that trade then passes through territory that may be held by non-state actors, it serves as a revenue. So they tax the product as it comes through. They don't take it for themselves necessarily, but they tax the product. So it's a way of raising revenue for themselves. And then, of course, what they use for that, either investing in their own weapons or training. So the discussion is really about understanding the nature of the trade and recognizing that many of the people that are facilitating this trade are commodity agnostic. They don't really care whether it's drugs, humans, elephant, ivory, or whatever it is. It's a commodity that simply allows someone to make money by virtue of the passage of that trade through. So then it's a case of, well, how do you make it in someone's interest to stop this trade? How do you make it in someone's interest whereby actually they can benefit from an alternative revenue as opposed to necessarily this one? And what does that look like? Again, it's the big picture discussions that need to be had. How can you disrupt this trade? How much do we understand about the ecosystems that exist around the trade? Not just the people who are undertaking the trade, but the ecosystem that supports them. And where is the opportunity to disrupt the trade, and where are its vulnerabilities? So if you imagine it's like the maritime sea is used as a main kind of conduit to ship a lot of the stuff that's getting in back and forth. But if you imagine it's like a tree with its roots in the country of origin, the trunk across the maritime domain, and then the branches are in the point of destination. Where are the opportunities then to bring that tree down? Disrupting that associated with the trade.
It just, it seems to me by looking through history that nothing really changes. That it's always seems to be a rush for resources, drugs being part of it, human trafficking, slavery, that sort. All the things that we associate with, the colonial era over that several 100-year period, when people were making fortunes out of it. And when you've got money, yeah, you can make things work, right? You can grease the right palms. But Charlie, I have to say, I don't envy you your job. It sounds like you've got a bit of a task on your hands.
Well, it's fascinating. It is. Every day's a challenge, but I like a challenge.
It's super fascinating. Another thing we've done an hour already, just over an hour. Can you believe it? We talked a little bit before about your love of rugby and your involvement in the expansion worldwide of rugby. So we'll finish on a more cheery note, shall we say? So I mean, these are the hard facts. People need to know what's going on.
I'm actually really young. I just had a bad personal run.
Yeah. Same. So just because we talked about it sounds very interesting. So what can you tell us about what's going on in this field? Well,
I think it's several elements to it. One of which is, my eldest son started playing for England in the national squad there. So there's an enormous pride in what he's doing and what the squad's doing.
He's a hell of a player.
As a player, yeah.
He's a hell of a player, though. I was watching him against South Africa, the first game, right?
New Zealand was the first game.
Sorry, New Zealand. That was
South Africa.
He is a hell of a player, by the way. I think he certainly one of the standouts for me in that match. He's a big guy. How big are you? How tall are you?
I'm 6'2".
Okay.
And
but he's a big
3.
Yeah.
Which is extraordinary for prop, because the dynamics, the physiologics of those guys has evolved so much from how they used to be set when I was growing.
It's when you see these guys in real life, these professional rugby players, they are. I don't know where they come from. I don't know how they get that big. They're absolute big, huge units. So
yes,
yeah. So congratulations on your genes, your offspring, because that's pretty impressive.
Thank you. No, it's very exciting. But we wish him and the team well. But I think to answer your question, what is of interest to me is my wife's American, so we live. We will live, I should say, when I retire on the West Coast. And what is interesting, of course, is that the US has been awarded the World Cup in 2031 and the Women's World Cup Rugby World Cup in 2033. Now, the pathway towards that, we've had the Olympics this year in Paris, where the women's sevens did very well, and you look at someone like Ilona Maher, she came out of that. She's one of the American ladies, women's players, who came away with something like 6 million followers on Instagram, just as a result of that we following her now. If you look at the kind of US as a marketplace, they've got 800,000 people who are currently playing in the US playing rugby as a potential growth market. So it has enormous growth potential. And the interesting thing for me now is how do you develop the pathway between now and 2031? How do you deliver effective gains, and how do you protect a legacy? Now, of course, if you look at the experience of Japan in 2019, as a second-tier nation hosting the Rugby World Cup, it's possible. You can do it, and you can do it very effectively. And look at the effect that's now had on Japanese rugby in terms of promoting the sport. But there are issues for the United States that the clock is ticking. In order for them to put on a good sport, a good tournament, the next World Cup is in 2027, which is down in Australia. The national team in America, called the Eagles, will automatically play in Australia by virtue of the fact that they're hosting next. They didn't make it this year. Last year, the last World Cup. So there's a lot of focus now on what it means, what needs to be done to grow the base, to develop a pathway for not just in terms of clubs, but also the national team. And you look at America, national teams are not really something from the Olympics, not really something the American people get. It's more about franchises, clubs, and all the money that's associated. So how do you build an interest in the game? How do you develop, for instance, the pathway from high school to college, from college into the major league program, and then into the national program as well? And all of the kind of challenges that we're encountering here in Europe as well, in the UK. The clock is ticking, as I say, and there's a lot of focus that needs to be done to get over the finishing line. I think there's opportunities to sort of be very effective. If they get it right, the growth potential is huge, and the kind of rewards from that are enormous.
Did they have a national rugby league? They've got probably not the right word to use, but a national rugby association. I don't know what you call it.
It's the Major League Rugby, which is something which has about 11. It's 11 teams. So it's very much divided between the Eastern Conference and the Western Conference.
Yeah,
and again, what we're talking about earlier on, the rewards and the revenue returns are not that great because the number of people, the stadiums aren't big, so the ticket sales aren't big. So it's that classic sort of thing. There's interest, but what we're talking about here is not just about the growth of the sport and putting all of the effort into developing the pathway, but it's also how do you then start bringing the corporate component? How do you bring the networks, the broadcasters on board so that they actually see that there's a way of making money out of it? Because of course rugby is a fluid game, whereas if you look at American football, every 10 minutes there's a commercial. And so it's how do you create an interest in the game? And there is a lot of interest actually on the West Coast. And I think women's rugby now is the fastest growing sport in women's sport in schools. And so where we live, everybody's transitioning from football to rugby because they love the game. They love the values it represents. They love these big guys walking around the pitch carrying their baby sons and daughters and shaking hands and the kind of values that you don't really see it so much.
I remember a few years ago, I can't remember, within the last 10 years anyway, when out of season, so out of not in the World Cup cycle and not during the Six Nations, when Australia played New Zealand at Soldier Field in Chicago, which is, I think it holds 106, it holds a lot of people anyway. A hell of a lot of people. And it was an absolute sellout. Fantastic game as well, but an absolute sellout. I think they picked Chicago because it has a large Irish population or of Irish extraction population. But it was huge. And it looked like, to be honest here, watching it on TV, it looked like it was a great day because the weather was great and everyone looked like they were having a good time. So I can see that I was quite surprised, first and foremost, to see that there was a sellout in such a huge stadium. But there is an appetite, I think. I actually started to watch. I'm more likely to watch a rugby match than I am to watch a football match now. And I'm a football man since I was a kid. Played rugby too, but I'm much more of a football guy. But I find it's exciting, and it's an exciting game to watch. I wouldn't like to play it nowadays. But
it's having, and I think we now have the new chair of World Rugby, Brett Robertson, who's the Australian from Australia. He's now he's being appointed this week. He's got some really, really good ideas growing the base, and ensuring financial sustainability and stability across not just the kind of top tier one countries, but across the entire rugby world. And it's about how do you promote an interest in the sport? How do you get parents involved? How do you reassure them that kids' safety and health has been taken care of? How do you get people interested in this wonderful game? And how do you get the revenues? How do you make it sustainable? And that's the challenge he's front. But I think he's the right man for the job. It's wonderful that he's been selected, and we wish him well.
It's pretty impressive, Charlie, that you seem to like very challenging things to do. Complicated.
Well, as someone said to me the other day, aim for the stars, but if you hit the ceiling, it doesn't matter. It's still going up.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, Charlie, I'm going to let you go because I know you might not have any work to do this afternoon, but I've got some stuff I need to do. So just to say thank you so much for being a guest, and I actually would like very much to meet you one day, and we can have a good old chat about some various other things that I wanted to talk to you about as well. So just do you have any socials that people can find you apart from LinkedIn? I think we're on LinkedIn together.
It's LinkedIn and Instagram, I think, is the two.
Okay. Oh yeah, I just follow. I think I just sent you a request on Instagram this morning, actually, as it happens. So just to say again, thank you so much. Pleasure having you on, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Much obliged, and I hope I wish you the very best of luck. And it's been a privilege to be part of this. So thank you.
Thank you very much
for reaching out.
It's very kind. All right, all the best. Thanks for listening.